The Galactic Xenobiology Institute on Kepler Station had seen its share of academic disasters, but nothing quite prepared Professor Vexthal for what was about to unfold in her Advanced Planetary Studies seminar. The amphibious Aquarian adjusted her moisture suit and gazed across the lecture hall at her collection of the galaxy's supposedly brightest minds, all blissfully unaware that they were about to receive an education that would haunt their nightmares for cycles to come. "Final projects," she announced, her voice carrying the particular brand of weary authority that came from decades of dealing with overconfident students. "You will each study a primitive world and present your findings to the Galactic Academic Council." The class stirred with the kind of excitement that only came from academic superiority complexes. Zephyr, a crystalline siliconite whose geometric form refracted light in patterns that hurt to look at directly, vibrated at frequencies that suggested mathematical smugness. Beside her, Corvin's insectoid form clicked in harmony with the dozen other fragments of his hive mind scattered throughout the classroom. Lyra, existing as a barely contained cloud of ionized gas, pulsed with colors that roughly translated to, "This will be easy." Even Thorn, the rock-based mineralian whose thoughts moved at geological speeds, managed to convey anticipation through subtle shifts in his crystalline structure. "Now," Professor Vexthal continued, her gill slits fluttering with what might have been amusement, "let's see who gets the honor of studying Sol 3, more commonly known as Earth." The digital lottery spun, and fate, displaying either a cruel sense of humor or perfect cosmic justice, selected the four most arrogant specimens in the class. Zephyr's crystalline form dimmed slightly as the assignment appeared on her interface. Corvin's clicking shifted to a confused pattern. Lyra's gaseous form swirled with colors that suggested mild disappointment. Thorn, being Thorn, took approximately 3 standard minutes to process the information. "Earth," Zephyr announced, her voice carrying harmonic frequencies of disdain. "Class XII Deathworld. Primitive carbon-based lifeforms. Singular star system. How quaint." "The designation is largely historical," Professor Vexthal explained, though something in her tone suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "The humans have been surprisingly adaptive. You'll find them quite manageable." Corvin's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his species. "Carbon-based life on a single world, how did they even achieve spaceflight without proper collective consciousness? More importantly," Lyra interjected, her gaseous form rippling with amusement, "how do they function without energy-based neural networks? Do they actually use chemical processes for thought?" The class dissolved into the academic equivalent of snickering. Even Thorn managed to convey amusement through a series of low-frequency rumbles that took several minutes to complete. Professor Vexthal watched this display with the expression of someone who had just lit a very long fuse. "I'm sure you'll find the humans educational. Your transport leaves in 2 cycles." 3 standard days later, the 4 students found themselves aboard a research vessel approaching Earth's orbital station. The planet hung below them like a blue and white marble, deceptively peaceful and utterly unremarkable. Zephyr ran preliminary scans while Corvin interfaced with the station's primitive data networks. Lyra observed the electromagnetic signatures and Thorn slowly, very slowly, began to process the visual data. 71% water coverage, Zephyr reported, her crystalline form cycling through analytical patterns. Nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, single moon, tidal forces present, temperature variance of over 60 degrees Celsius depending on location. How do they manage atmospheric consistency with such primitive weather control? "They don't," came a voice from behind them. The 4 students turned to see a bipedal figure approaching, roughly humanoid but lacking any of the obvious adaptations they'd expected from a Deathworld species. No exoskeleton, no visible sensory organs beyond 2 simple optical receptors, no apparent defensive capabilities. Dr. Marcus Chen looked, by all galactic standards, disappointingly ordinary. "Dr. Chen," he introduced himself, extending a hand in what they'd been briefed was a primitive greeting ritual. "I'll be your liaison during your stay. Welcome to Earth's orbital research station." Zephyr's form flickered with confusion. "You said they don't control their weather. How do you survive atmospheric inconsistencies?" Marcus blinked, a gesture that seemed to involve temporarily shutting down his primary optical sensors. "We adapt? I mean, we have buildings and clothes and stuff. Though I suppose the earthquake last week did knock out power for a few hours." "Earthquake?" Corvin's clicking intensified. "Your planet's crust is unstable?" "Oh, that was just a small one. maybe 6.2 on the Richter scale. Nothing serious. Marcus shrugged, another gesture that seemed to involve temporarily disabling his skeletal structure. Anyway, shall we start with the tour? The tour began with what Marcus cheerfully described as Earth's basic atmospheric composition. The students dutifully recorded data about pressure variations, seasonal changes, and something called weather patterns that seemed to involve the atmosphere randomly deciding to become hostile without warning. So this rain phenomenon, Lyra asked, her gaseous form swirling with confusion. It's uncontrolled precipitation of dihydrogen monoxide? Pretty much, Marcus confirmed. Sometimes it comes down pretty hard. Last month we had a storm that dropped 6 inches in an hour, flooded half the city. And you just accept this? Zephyr's crystalline structure was beginning to show stress fractures. Well, what else can you do? It's just weather. The concept of just weather was apparently untranslatable into any known galactic language. Corvin's hive mind fragments spent several minutes trying to process the idea of accepting random atmospheric violence as a normal part of existence. What about the electromagnetic discharges? Thorn asked, his question taking long enough that Marcus had begun to wonder if the Mineralian had forgotten what he was saying. You mean lightning? Yeah, that happens during thunderstorms. Sometimes it hits things, sometimes it starts fires, sometimes it kills people. Marcus said this with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, which, technically, he was. It kills people? Lyra's gaseous form had shifted to colors that roughly translated to existential horror. And you just go outside anyway. Well, you try to avoid being struck by lightning. It's not that hard. The odds are only about 1 in a million per year. In a million? Zephyr's voice rose several harmonic frequencies. That's a significant statistical probability for a fatal environmental hazard, is it? Marcus looked genuinely puzzled. I mean, you're more likely to die in a car accident, or from heart disease, or cancer, or about 100 other things. The word cancer caused Corvin's clicking to stop entirely, which for a hive mind was roughly equivalent to a system crash. Your own biological systems attack themselves. Sometimes, bodies are complicated. Cells malfunction. DNA gets damaged. Things happen. Marcus continued, with the kind of casual acceptance that suggested he'd never considered these facts to be particularly alarming. But surely your medical technology can prevent such malfunctions? Zephyr asked, her form now cycling through patterns that indicated severe analytical stress. We're working on it. We've made a lot of progress. Average human lifespan is up to about 80 years now. 80 years? Lyra's voice carried the kind of horror usually reserved for cosmic catastrophes. You're telling us that your biological systems are programmed to fail within 80 standard years? Well, it varies. Some people live to be over 100, others die younger. Disease, accidents, violence, old age. Marcus trailed off, apparently realizing that his audience had gone very quiet. Thorn's rumbling eventually resolved into words. Did you say violence? Well, that's not really a problem anymore. I mean, we still have wars and murders and stuff, but it's way better than it used to be. The 20th century was pretty rough. The students exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey shared terror across 4 completely different sensory systems. Zephyr's crystalline form had developed several new stress fractures. Corvin's clicking had devolved into static. Lyra's gaseous form was cycling through colors that didn't exist in any known spectrum. Even Thorn seemed to be processing information faster than usual, which was deeply concerning. Wars, Corvin managed to click out. You know, organized violence between groups, usually over resources or territory or ideology, though sometimes it's just because people don't like each other. Marcus seemed to be warming to the subject. We've gotten pretty good at it over the centuries. The last big one only killed about 50 million people. 50 million? Zephyr's voice had climbed so high it was approaching ultrasonic frequencies. Well, depending on how you count, the numbers vary, but hey, that was decades ago. We've learned a lot since then. Such as? Lyra asked, though her form suggested she might not want to know the answer. Better weapons, mostly. More efficient delivery systems. Improved targeting. Though we've also gotten better at diplomacy and conflict resolution. Marcus paused thoughtfully. Of course, the weapons have gotten more efficient too. Nuclear weapons can level entire cities now. Nuclear weapons? Thorn's question emerged as a low-frequency rumble that took nearly 5 minutes to complete. Yeah, fusion and fission bombs. We've got thousands of them, enough to destroy the planet several times over. It's called mutually assured destruction. Pretty clever system, really. The students had reached that special state of horror where the mind simply stops processing new information. They stood in silence, trying to absorb the reality that they were studying a species that had weaponized stellar fusion and pointed it at themselves. But surely, Zephyr said desperately, surely you've moved beyond such primitive behaviors? Oh, absolutely. We hardly use nuclear weapons anymore. Mostly we just threaten each other with them. It's much more civilized. Marcus checked his chronometer. Speaking of which, we should head down to the surface. I want to show you a typical human habitat. The descent to Earth's surface provided the students with their first real glimpse of the planet's true nature. The research shuttle bucked and shuddered as it encountered what Marcus casually described as a bit of turbulence. Atmospheric conditions that would have grounded any civilized species indefinitely. Is the atmospheric envelope always this unstable? Corvan asked, his clicking made erratic by the violent motion. Only during weather, Marcus replied cheerfully, though I suppose it is weather season. Weather season. Lyra's gaseous form was being compressed and expanded by the pressure changes in a way that suggested severe discomfort. You know, spring, summer, fall, winter. Each one has its own special brand of trying to kill you. Spring floods, summer heat waves, autumn hurricanes, winter blizzards. Right now we're heading into tornado season. Tornado season? Zephyr's crystalline structure was beginning to resonate with the shuttle's vibrations, creating an ominous harmonic frequency. Yeah, rotating columns of air that can reach speeds of over 300 miles per hour. They basically act like atmospheric blenders, tearing up everything in their path. We get about 1,000 of them per year. The shuttle landed with a bone-jarring thud that would have killed any properly evolved species. The students disembarked onto a platform that swayed alarmingly in what Marcus described as a gentle breeze, but which registered as a significant atmospheric disturbance on their instruments. Welcome to Kansas, Marcus announced, gesturing toward a landscape that looked deceptively peaceful. Home to some of the world's most beautiful tornadoes, the students stared at the horizon, where towering clouds were building with a violence that suggested the atmosphere was preparing for war. Lightning flickered within the formations, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. Those clouds, Thorne observed, his geological perspective allowing him to process the scale involved, they extend approximately 15 kilometers into the atmosphere. Yeah, that's a pretty good storm system building up. Should be fun to watch. Marcus pulled out a device that the students recognized as a primitive electromagnetic sensor. Wind speeds are already picking up. We might get some really good rotation later. And you enjoy this? Lyra asked, her gaseous form flickering with disbelief. Are you kidding? Storm watching is great. There's nothing quite like seeing nature at its most violent. Really puts things in perspective. The phrase nature at its most violent was apparently another untranslatable concept. The students spent several minutes trying to process the idea that humans actually sought out dangerous weather phenomena for entertainment. What about shelter? Zephyr asked desperately. Surely you have atmospheric shields or weather control systems. We have buildings, Marcus said proudly. Some of them can withstand pretty strong winds, though every now and then a tornado will level a whole town. But we just rebuild. You just rebuild? Corvin's clicking had taken on a distinctly hysterical note. Sure, what else would you do? It's not like you can argue with a tornado. The concept of accepting random destruction as a normal part of existence was beginning to break down the students' fundamental understanding of civilized behavior. They were species that had conquered their environments, bent nature to their will, created perfect societies free from random violence. The idea that anyone would simply accept atmospheric assault as just weather was beyond their comprehension. Perhaps, Zephyr suggested hopefully, we could examine your urban centers? Surely those are more controlled? Great idea, Marcus agreed. Chicago's only about an hour away. We can take the interstate. The journey to Chicago introduced the students to another uniquely human concept: traffic. The idea that millions of individuals would simultaneously operate high-speed vehicles in close proximity, relying entirely on painted lines and mutual cooperation to avoid catastrophic collisions, struck them as a form of mass insanity. The average traffic fatality rate, Marcus explained cheerfully, is only about 1.33 deaths per 100 million miles traveled. Pretty safe, really. Safe? Zephyr's voice had reached frequencies that were causing nearby glass to vibrate. You're traveling at lethal speeds in unshielded vehicles with no collision avoidance systems. Well, we have seatbelts and airbags, and most people are pretty good drivers. Marcus navigated around a massive transport vehicle with casual ease. Though I suppose there are about 40,000 traffic deaths per year in the United States alone. 40,000? Lyra's gaseous form had compressed into something resembling a small, terrified cloud. Yeah, but that's way better than it used to be. Cars are much safer now. Better engineering, improved materials, advanced safety systems. Marcus paused to avoid a collision with another vehicle, whose operator appeared to be attempting vehicular combat. Plus, we've got better trauma care, so more people survive crashes that would have killed them decades ago. The students were beginning to understand that humans had a very unique relationship with the concept of safety. Where other species sought to eliminate risk, humans seemed to accept it as an inevitable part of existence, then develop elaborate systems to slightly reduce their chances of death, while continuing to engage in fundamentally lethal activities. Chicago's skyline rose before them like a monument to controlled insanity. Thousands of humans worked and lived in towers that stretched hundreds of meters into the air, apparently unbothered by the fact that they were suspended above the ground in structures that swayed visibly in the wind. Skyscrapers, Marcus announced proudly. Engineering marvels. The Willis Tower is 442 meters tall, and it moves, Thorne observed, his geological perspective allowing him to detect the subtle oscillations that the building's human occupants seem to ignore. All tall buildings sway in the wind. It's designed to be flexible. If it were rigid, it would break. Marcus seemed to find this perfectly reasonable. The Willis Tower can sway up to 3 feet at the top in strong winds. 3 feet? Zephyr's crystalline form was now emitting stress frequencies that were causing nearby electronics to malfunction. And people work in there? Sure. Great views from the top floors, though some people get vertigo. The concept of voluntarily placing oneself in a swaying tower hundreds of meters above the ground was apparently another uniquely human behavior. The students were beginning to compile a mental list of activities that any sane species would classify as elaborate suicide attempts, but which humans seem to consider normal. What about seismic activity? Corvin asked, his hive mind having finally processed the earthquake reference from earlier. Chicago's pretty stable geologically speaking, we're not on a major fault line. Marcus gestured toward the west. Now, California, that's a different story. The San Andreas fault runs right through it. They get earthquakes all the time. And people live there? Lyra asked, her gaseous form flickering with disbelief. Oh, millions of people. Great weather, beautiful scenery, excellent beaches. Sure, the ground shakes regularly, and they're overdue for a major earthquake that could kill hundreds of thousands of people, but the quality of life is fantastic. The students were beginning to suspect that humans might have a fundamentally different relationship with mortality than other galactic species. Where normal beings sought to extend their existence and minimize risk, humans seem to accept danger as an inevitable part of life, then build entire civilizations around managing the consequences of their own poor survival instincts. Perhaps, Zephyr suggested desperately, we could examine your biological systems? Surely evolution has provided you with adequate defensive mechanisms. Defensive mechanisms? Marcus laughed, a sound that involved temporarily compromising his respiratory system. Have you seen the human body? We're basically walking disasters waiting to happen. This observation led to a detailed discussion of human biology that left the students questioning the fundamental principles of evolution. Humans, it turned out, were a species that had somehow survived, despite having bodies that seemed designed by a committee of sadists with a poor understanding of engineering principles. Our spines, Marcus explained, are basically repurposed fish backbones that we've stretched vertical. They're under constant stress and frequently fail. Back pain is endemic. Your primary support structure is fundamentally flawed, Thorne rumbled, his geological perspective making him appreciate the importance of proper structural support. Gets worse. Our knees are joints that were designed for four-legged locomotion, adapted for bipedal movement. They wear out constantly. Most humans need knee replacements by their 70s. Knee replacements? Corvin's clicking had taken on a distinctly panicked note. Yeah. We cut out the damaged joint and install artificial components. Pretty routine surgery. We do hundreds of thousands of them per year. The idea that an entire species had evolved such poorly designed bodies that surgical modification was considered routine maintenance was beyond the students' comprehension. They were beginning to understand that humans hadn't conquered their environment through superior evolution. They'd done it, despite having bodies that seemed actively hostile to survival. But surely, Lyra asked hopefully, your cognitive systems are more robust? Our brains? Marcus considered this. Well, they're pretty remarkable organs, but they're also incredibly fragile. A minor blow to the head can cause permanent damage. We're constantly producing chemicals that can cause hallucinations, depression, anxiety, or complete personality changes. Oh, and they're susceptible to dozens of degenerative diseases that slowly destroy our memories and identities. Your cognitive systems attacked themselves. Zephyr's voice had reached frequencies that were causing nearby windows to crack. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Marcus ticked off the list with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. The brain is basically a 3-pound mass of electrical jelly that somehow produces consciousness. It's amazing it works at all. The students were beginning to understand that humans were not just survivors of a death world, they were ambulatory proof that evolution sometimes produces species that succeed despite every biological system being a potential point of failure. They were like machines built from defective parts that somehow managed to function through sheer bloody-minded determination. What about your immune systems? Corvin asked, his hive mind desperately seeking some evidence of proper biological design. Oh, those are fun, Marcus said cheerfully. They're basically internal armies that fight constant wars against bacteria, viruses, parasites, and cancer cells. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. Sometimes they get confused and attack our own bodies. They attack your own bodies? Lyra's gaseous form was now cycling through colors that didn't exist in any known spectrum of horror. Autoimmune diseases, allergies. Sometimes your immune system decides that peanuts are deadly enemies and tries to kill you for eating them. Sometimes it attacks your joints or your skin or your organs. Bodies are complicated. The students were rapidly approaching the limits of their ability to process information. They had come to study a primitive species on a simple death world, and instead they were discovering that humans were walking biological disasters who had somehow managed to build a technological civilization while inhabiting bodies that seemed designed by a malevolent deity with a cruel sense of humor. Surely, Zephyr said desperately, your technology compensates for these biological limitations? To some extent, Marcus agreed, though we've also gotten pretty good at creating new ways to accidentally kill ourselves. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, industrial accidents, pharmaceutical side effects, environmental pollution. You poison your own environment? Thorne asked, his geological perspective making him appreciate the importance of maintaining planetary stability. Not on purpose. Well, usually not on purpose, but industrial processes produce waste, and sometimes that waste is toxic. We've gotten better at managing it, but we've also gotten better at producing more exotic forms of pollution. Such as? Corvin asked, though his clicking suggested he might not want to know. Plastic microparticles, radioactive contamination, pharmaceutical residues, persistent organic pollutants, heavy metals. Marcus ticked off the list with the casual tone of someone discussing a shopping list. Though we've made real progress on reducing emissions and developing cleaner technologies, the students were beginning to understand that humans were a species that had achieved technological advancement not through careful planning and risk management, but through a process of trial and error that had killed millions of them along the way. They were like a species-wide experiment in learning through catastrophic failure. But surely, Lyra asked hopefully, you've learned to avoid unnecessary risks. Unnecessary risks? Marcus laughed again, temporarily compromising his respiratory system. Have you heard of extreme sports? This question led to a discussion of human recreational activities that left the students questioning the fundamental principles of survival instinct. Humans, it turned out, were a species that had achieved safety and comfort, then deliberately sought out dangerous activities for entertainment. Rock climbing, Marcus explained, involves ascending vertical cliff faces using only your hands and feet, with minimal safety equipment. But why? Zephyr asked, her crystalline form emitting stress frequencies that were causing nearby electronics to malfunction. Because it's there, because it's challenging, because the view from the top is spectacular, because surviving something that could kill you makes you feel alive. The phrase, surviving something that could kill you makes you feel alive, was apparently another untranslatable concept. The students spent several minutes trying to process the idea that humans actively sought out life-threatening situations for psychological gratification. What about skydiving? Marcus continued enthusiastically. You jump out of a perfectly functional aircraft at high altitude and trust a fabric parachute to prevent you from hitting the ground at lethal velocity. And people do this for fun. Corvin's clicking had devolved into static. Millions of people. It's incredibly popular. There are about 3 million jumps per year in the United States alone. How many people die? Thorne asked, his geological perspective making him appreciate the importance of gravity. Only about 20 or 30 per year. Pretty safe, really, much safer than driving. The students were beginning to understand that humans had a unique relationship with the concept of safety. Where other species sought to eliminate risk, humans seemed to calibrate their acceptable risk levels based on statistical probability rather than absolute safety. They were willing to accept a certain number of deaths as the price of engaging in activities they found enjoyable. What about base jumping? Marcus asked. That's where you jump off cliffs, buildings, or bridges with a parachute. Much more dangerous than skydiving, but the adrenaline rush is incredible. Adrenaline rush? Lyra asked, her gaseous form flickering with confusion. Yeah, the biochemical response to danger. Your body floods with stress hormones. Your heart rate increases. Your reflexes sharpen. It's addictive. Some people spend their entire lives chasing that feeling. The concept of addiction to danger was apparently another uniquely human behavior. The students were beginning to understand that humans were a species that had evolved sophisticated biochemical reward systems that encouraged them to seek out exactly the kinds of situations that any sane species would avoid. As the day progressed, the students were exposed to an increasingly bewildering array of human activities that seemed designed to maximize risk while minimizing survival advantage. Humans drove vehicles at high speeds around circular tracks for entertainment. They engaged in organized combat sports, where the objective was to render opponents unconscious. They consumed ethanol, a toxic substance that impaired their cognitive function and motor control, as a form of social recreation. Motor racing, Marcus explained, involves driving specially designed vehicles at speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour in close proximity to other vehicles. And people watch this? Zephyr asked, her crystalline form now emitting frequencies that were causing nearby glass to shatter. Millions of people. It's incredibly popular, though I suppose the crashes are part of the appeal. Crashes? Corvin's clicking had taken on a distinctly hysterical note. Yeah, when drivers lose control and collide with walls, barriers, or other vehicles at high speed. Usually they survive, thanks to advanced safety systems, but sometimes they don't. The students were beginning to understand that humans were a species that had turned survival into entertainment. They had taken the fundamental struggle of existence and transformed it into recreational activities that other species would classify as elaborate suicide attempts. What about boxing? Marcus continued. Two people enter a ring and attempt to render each other unconscious through repeated blows to the head. This is considered entertainment? Lyra asked, her gaseous form cycling through colors that roughly translated to existential despair. Oh, very popular. Though we've made it safer over the years, better protective equipment, improved medical monitoring, stricter rules about when to stop fights. How do you make deliberate brain trauma safer? Thorne asked, his geological perspective making him appreciate the importance of structural integrity. Well, you can't eliminate the risk entirely. Brain damage is pretty much inevitable in boxing, but we've reduced the fatality rate to only a few deaths per year. The students were beginning to understand that humans were a species that had accepted brain damage as an acceptable risk in exchange for entertainment value. They were like a civilization built around the principle that any activity that didn't involve a reasonable chance of death or permanent injury wasn't worth doing. By the time the sun was setting over Chicago, the students had compiled a list of human activities that would have been classified as mass suicide attempts by any civilized species. They had learned about humans who climbed mountains without oxygen, who dove to crushing depths without protective equipment, who deliberately exposed themselves to wild animals for photographic purposes, who consumed potentially lethal quantities of capsaicin-based substances as a form of culinary entertainment. I think, Marcus said as they prepared to return to the orbital station, you've gotten a pretty good overview of human culture. Any questions? The students exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey shared horror across 4 completely different sensory systems. They had come to study a primitive species on a simple Deathworld, and instead they had discovered that humans were the galaxy's most successful example of evolution through catastrophic failure. They were a species that had achieved technological advancement not despite their environment, but because of it. Just one question, Zephyr said, her crystalline form emitting stress frequencies that were causing nearby electronics to malfunction. "How are you still alive?" Marcus considered this for a moment, then shrugged with the casual gesture that seemed to involve temporarily disabling his skeletal structure. "I guess we're just too stubborn to die." The journey back to the orbital station passed in contemplative silence. The students spent the time trying to process what they had learned, while Marcus dozed peacefully in his seat, apparently unbothered by the fact that he was traveling at lethal speeds through a hostile environment in a vehicle that could catastrophically fail at any moment. 2 weeks later, the 4 students stood before the Galactic Academic Council, prepared to present their findings on the primitive species of Sol 3. Professor Vexthal watched from the audience with the expression of someone who had been anticipating this moment for cycles. "Honored council members," Zephyr began, her crystalline form emitting frequencies that suggested barely controlled panic, "we have completed our study of the species known as humans, and we have reached some disturbing conclusions." The council members leaned forward with interest. Studies of primitive species were usually routine academic exercises, useful for understanding the early stages of evolutionary development. They were not expecting to hear anything that would challenge their fundamental understanding of civilized behavior. "First," Corvin continued, his clicking patterns indicating severe psychological stress, "we must revise our classification of Sol 3. It is not simply a Class XII Deathworld, it is, by any reasonable standard, the most hostile environment ever studied by this council." "The planet's atmospheric system," Lyra added, her gaseous form cycling through colors that didn't exist in any known spectrum of horror, "is in a constant state of violent instability. Electromagnetic discharges regularly occur at energy levels sufficient to kill most known life forms. Atmospheric pressure variations can exceed survivable limits within hours. The temperature differential between regions can vary by over 60 degrees Celsius. The geological structure," Thorne rumbled, his words emerging with the ponderous weight of geological time, "is fundamentally unstable. The planetary crust is fractured into mobile segments that regularly shift position, causing massive seismic events. Volcanic activity occurs on a scale that would sterilize most civilized worlds. And yet," Zephyr continued, her voice rising to frequencies that were causing the council chamber's acoustic systems to malfunction, "the humans not only survive in this environment, they thrive in it. They have built a technological civilization while inhabiting bodies that seem designed by a committee of sadists with a poor understanding of engineering principles." The council members were beginning to look concerned. This was not the usual academic presentation about primitive tool use and basic social structures. This sounded like a description of a species that had achieved the impossible. "Their biological systems," Corvin clicked rapidly, "are fundamentally flawed. Their primary support structures regularly fail. Their cognitive systems are susceptible to chemical imbalances that can cause complete personality changes. Their immune systems frequently attack their own bodies. Their DNA is constantly degrading, causing cellular malfunction and inevitable death within approximately 80 standard years. Their reproductive process," Lyra added, her gaseous form flickering with disbelief, "requires 2 individuals to engage in biological processes that exchange genetic material through direct physical contact. The offspring are completely helpless for years and require constant care to survive." "And yet," Thorne continued, his words emerging with the slow weight of geological certainty, "they have achieved technological advancement that rivals our own. They have developed energy systems based on stellar fusion. They have created artificial intelligence systems. They have achieved spaceflight and established permanent orbital installations." "More disturbing," Zephyr said, her crystalline form now emitting stress frequencies that were causing nearby electronics to malfunction throughout the council chambers, "is how they achieved this advancement. They did not conquer their environment through superior evolution or careful planning. They succeeded through a process of trial and error that killed millions of them along the way." The council members were beginning to understand that they were not hearing about a primitive species that had somehow achieved basic spaceflight. They were hearing about a species that had achieved technological advancement through what could only be described as evolution through catastrophic failure. "They have weaponized stellar fusion," Corvin clicked, his patterns indicating barely controlled panic, and pointed it at themselves. "They possess sufficient nuclear weapons to destroy their own planet multiple times over. They call this mutually assured destruction and consider it a form of diplomacy. They engage in recreational activities, Lyra continued, her gaseous form cycling through colors that suggested existential despair, that any civilized species would classify as elaborate suicide attempts. They deliberately seek out dangerous situations for psychological gratification. They consume toxic substances, Thorne added, his words emerging with the slow weight of geological disapproval, that impair their cognitive function and motor control. They do this for entertainment, and most disturbing of all, Zephyr concluded, her voice reaching frequencies that were causing structural damage to the council chambers, they consider all of this to be normal behavior. The council chambers fell silent. The implications of what they were hearing were slowly sinking in. They had been dealing with a species that had achieved technological advancement not through careful planning and risk management, but through a process of learning through catastrophic failure that had killed millions of them along the way. Are you telling us, the council chairman asked slowly, that the humans are a species that has achieved technological advancement while inhabiting a planet that is actively trying to kill them, using bodies that are fundamentally flawed, through a process of trial and error that would have exterminated any sane species? Yes, the four students replied in unison, their combined voices creating a harmonic frequency that caused several council members to experience temporary sensory disruption. And they consider this normal? They call it Tuesday, Zephyr replied, her crystalline form emitting stress frequencies that were causing the council chamber's structural supports to vibrate ominously. The council chairman leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. They had assumed that humans were a primitive species that had somehow achieved basic spaceflight despite their obvious limitations. Instead, they were dealing with a species that had achieved technological advancement through what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness. What are your recommendations? The chairman asked. The four students exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey shared terror across four completely different sensory systems. We recommend, Zephyr said, her voice climbing to frequencies that were approaching the limits of audible sound, that the council immediately approve the human application for Galactic Federation membership. On what grounds? The chairman asked. Because, Corvin clicked rapidly, any species that can survive their own planet while inhabiting bodies